So it's kind of funny, they mentioned that I was a former flying squirrel biologist. My assistant a little while ago was introducing me at an event, and she left out the biologist. So she just said Ken was a former flying squirrel. It changed over time, you know. Also like biologist. I'm happy to be here today. This event being hosted by diverse groups from the Sierra Club to the CEP, the Communication, Energy, and Paper Workers Union. It was years ago that you could not have considered the tree huggers together with the tree cutters hosting an event together. But in the last 10 years, there's been enough of recognition of common ground that it's become a relatively common thing. For example, we're going to have a big rally on March the 16th in Victoria for sustainable forestry, and we're expecting hundreds of the mill workers from Harmac and Crofton to come join all the dreadlocks and bongos as well. So it's going to be a very diverse crowd. And so I'm happy to be here today. Now, I was informed that I'd be talking about raw log exports and related forest policies. And actually, my emphasis is going to be on the related forest policies. It's the bigger ecological and policy context that I'll be speaking about. And raw log exports are part of the discussion. And so there'll be a section in my presentation which was actually devised more about the ecology of old-growth forests on Vancouver Island. So it's very Vancouver Island-centric. But the concepts are applicable in large part to the coast here and even to some of the interior. But as we get towards the part that is most relevant to raw log exports, then I'll slow down the slideshow and explain more detail. But I will go relatively quick because there's just so many slides through some parts of it that are more like animals and ecology and nature. But I think that's an important part of the story as well. So people will often think when they hear the name Ancient Forest Alliance that our goal is just to stop logging. Don't log ancient forests, don't log, is sort of the concept that some might still have. But over time we've made it clear that no, we're in alliance with forestry workers as wherever we can find common ground to create a situation that works best for everybody. So we believe that we need a sustainable, value-added, second growth coastal forest industry as well. And our concern about raw log exports is that if we're going to be able to protect our old growth forests and sustain forestry employment levels at the same time, we have to do more with the wood that we cut instead of going the opposite direction, which is doing less and exporting the raw resource abroad. So it takes us in precisely the wrong direction where we lose the trees and we lose the jobs. So what I'll be talking about here is the different parts of a plan that we're proposing that would help to keep our old growth trees and ensure sustainable value-added second growth forestry. So maybe if we can get the lights actually, because the images here are pretty awesome. Is anyone able to get at least these front ones here?
This over here. Paul, behind you. And shut the door.
Okay. So this here is heaven on earth. How many people have been to Flores Island near Tofino? It really is. If you've been there, you know it's a stunning place. This area, Cow Bay, is where the whale watching tours go in Tofino to see the gray whales. And there's humpback whales these days. Even sea otters are coming back in there. Sea lions. The old growth forest carpet this area. It's about 150 square kilometers of virtually contiguous old growth forest. And the large carnivores are still there. The wolves, cougars, bears, probably even a few Sasquatch. So, I always mention Sasquatch if people see me like So actually my friend Katrina just hiked the Wildside Trail a little while ago, and there was a giant dead male sea lion. The Steller sea lions are huge. They're like a small whale in size. And a pack of wolves had been eating it. It's clearly being eaten by wolves. It wouldn't be people chewing on them. So it's a pretty amazing place when you think that we've got the large marine mammals that wash up on shore, and then the large carnivores come down from the old growth forest to eat them. That's an awesome part of the planet. And we still have a place like this. So I'll talk about some of the conservation concerns first about old growth forests, then we'll get into forest policy as it relates to jobs and raw log exports. And we really are blessed. If you think about the number of jurisdictions on the planet that still have, in the temperate industrialized zones in particular, that still have these types of old growth temperate rainforests, it's very scarce. There's very few places left now. In the Oregon, for example, Washington, Oregon, you're looking at about 5 to 10% left of the old growth forest left in the entirety of the western part of those states. And California, I think, is about 3%. So we're in a very fortunate situation that we still have on Vancouver Island, and not so much Sunshine Coast, I think it's been pretty hammered here, but in some parts of Vancouver Island and the mainland, you still have significant tracts of old growth forests. And here's an area that has a 12-month growing season, and the species have evolved to take advantage of that. So there's the Castle Giant in the Walbrand Valley. Now again, my apologies, it's very Vancouver Island centric for a lot of the images and the maps here. We will have data for the southwest mainland within a few days actually. But for now, it's all Vancouver Island. So you can see in the red in the southeast side of Vancouver Island is the coastal Douglas fir zone. And isn't it here in Powell River? You've got a little sliver of coastal Douglas fir, is that a little further north towards Lund?
Yeah, and 4 fir trees.
Is it coastal Douglas fir ecosystem?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
North towards Lund and Texada.
Myrtle Rock to just into Lund.
Yeah, just like a little sliver here on the mainland, and
Back
sort of mini Mediterranean. But we were lucky that on Vancouver Island we've got a bigger chunk of that type of ecosystem with our Butis trees, Douglas firs, Gary oak meadows. But there's only 1% of the old growth left in that red zone. As you go further and further west into these, in the coastal western hemlock and into the hyper maritime zone, which is the subzone that basically is endless sideways rain, then you have more old growth into the wetter, more mountainous regions in the western side of the island. So I'll show you these maps here. These are actually from the Sierra Club, but around the time of European colonization, about 150 years ago, most of Vancouver Island was productive old growth forest. That's moderate to fast growth rates, where the big trees are, where logging historically occurs and mainly occurs today. Low productivity old growth refers to the bogs, the short pine kind of ecosystems on the western lowlands, as well as subalpine forests, the more scrubby forests that can be very old in some cases, but grow very slowly and are often stunted. Non-forest are the alpine areas. By 2004, which is the latest data we have, now that's changed in just a few days, but until then, this is the data that we have here. 73% of the original productive old growth forests had been logged, including 90% of the valley bottoms where the biggest trees grow. And the yellow is the previous logged are mainly second growth forests, and in some cases, city and agricultural land. And the contrast is even more striking for the South Island, where you get the biggest trees. Originally, the vast majority of the South Island was productive old growth forests, some of the grandest forests on the planet. And by 2004, we had lost 87% of the productive old growth forests on the South Island, including about 96% of the valley bottom productive old growth forests. Mainly it's second growth now on the South Island. I think your situation in the Sunshine Coast is even more dire, actually. It's more like here, like 98%, I think, of the old growth is gone in these lower elevations here. I don't know, where is the old growth in this area? Is there some old growth?
Little pockets, a couple 100 meters high.
Like higher elevation is where you get the bigger ones.
Small pockets.
But down at these elevations here, are there any significant stands of
The water, no.
Yeah, that's a real shame. We still have at some low elevation old growth on the South Island, so a lot of the images you're going to see are from those forests. So in terms of the context of second growth, of raw log exports, it's an important. There's an ecological basis for why raw log exports now are ramping up, and it's a story that hasn't been told much. And I'll expound on it as I go through these slides. But the basic idea is that the history of high-grade resource depletion, where the industry has taken the biggest, best trees in the valley bottoms and lower elevations that historically built the industry has resulted in diminishing returns as the industry moves up in elevation. The site productivity goes down, the trees get smaller, the species become less valuable, and it's more expensive to access those trees. So in that context where you have a maturing second growth stands, but the industry had originally been tooled for old growth, the mills had been tooled for old growth, and haven't been retooled largely for second growth, is one reason that you have the conditions for massive log exports from the maturing Douglas fir on those second growth, in those second growth stands. And another reason is because the industry also was historically built on the lower elevation species, on the big Sitka spruce long time ago in the valley bottoms, and Douglas firs and western red cedars. And increasingly, as they go up mountainsides and as the remaining old growth is further north, actually, now a lot of it's on the central coast, you get hemball stands, they call it. Mountain hemlock, western hemlock, amabilis fir, which normally were the junk species. Now, my understanding is in China now, they're opening up those markets for what was considered a junk species, or lower value species at least. And but they haven't also invested in the milling capacity around hemball as much. So just like we have the history of fishing down the food chain, where the biggest stocks are depleted, and then you move on to the next, and the entire way you shed jobs the whole way, and you lose, and the ecosystem increasingly collapses. That really is the history of forestry in coastal British Columbia over the last 100 years. It's taking the biggest best first, moving on to the next, and you end up with diminishing returns, and you lose jobs the whole way, and the ecosystem collapses. So that model of resource depletion and the loss of rural employment and of the ecosystem is something that is being repeated throughout history, and we can watch it happen here. You can, especially with today's satellite photo and Google Earth and all the mapping capabilities, we can see it happening and measure it quite precisely. So our stance is, why repeat history? Why not learn from history? Why support policies that take us to the end of a resource and watch this all happen and unfold? And it has already been unfolding on the coast. So our position is, we want to see a phase out, starting from immediately in some places like southern Vancouver Island and certainly a lot of the Sunshine Coast, of old growth logging, immediate ban in those areas, but a phase out with timelines of old growth logging in the other areas, depending on the scarcity of the old growth there. And it's got to be a phase out that is going to happen quicker than the natural phase out. The natural phase out is as a result of depletion of the resource. Once you log off the old growth, then you're going to have naturally you're going to have a second growth industry. So it's going to happen anyways. We're just saying, let's time it so that it happens sooner, before we run out of the unprotected old growth, than at the end. So, and at the same time then, what we have to do to sustain the forestry jobs is to ramp up the amount of value added through proactive regulations and incentives, carrots and sticks, as opposed to saying just let it rip, our hands are tied, the way the global markets work, we can't do anything. So we'll talk some more about some of those details. This is Vancouver Island's protected areas system. The legislated protected areas, where logging is prohibited. It's 13% of the land base is protected in parks, but that is only, they only comprise 6% of the productive forests. And the reason there's a discrepancy between 13% of the land base protected and 6% of the productive forests protected is because many of the parks are either like Strathcona, very beautiful alpine rock and ice without trees in some cases, or a lot of low productivity subalpine forests. You can see the mountain hemlocks growing on the granite rock face there. A lot of low productivity old growth in Strathcona, and some awesome old growth too, but productive. But largely higher elevation. And the parks on the west side of the island, a lot of them are actually these old growth shore pines, the coastal version of the lodgepole pine, and these ones can be up 300 to 400 years old, but at this point in time we're not fighting over this. In 20 years we will be though. Be like, don't cut down the giant broccoli trees. But So that'll be the next fight in 20 years. But for now, this is so the issue, right, is about these productive old growth forests. Is what a lot of the campaigns are about. Actually, I'll show you. If we go back and you look, so you look at where the park boundaries are. So you see Strathcona, the triangular area in the middle, and you see along the whole west coast of Vancouver Island, you have all those coastal parks. Now let's go back and look at the satellite maps. So you see Strathcona. I mean, it's almost perfectly shaped. And you can see there's the west side of Flores is protected, the Heshquet Peninsula is also protected, Brooks Peninsula, Cape Scott. So it's pretty clear. Now the public, doesn't see those sort of maps normally, so you just see, wow, look at there's so many parks. Okay. And so I know I'm talking to an educated audience on these issues, so forgive me if you know a lot of this stuff here, but I'm not sure exactly what level everyone's at. So I'll go over some of these basics on some of the old growth, second growth ecology. But a lot of times, you'll have discussions, Christmas time where your right-wing uncle will come and sit down and argue, and he'll be like, "What's the point in trying to save old growth forests? You replant the trees, and then there's no problem. Why are you continually complaining?" So here's the key. And then you have environmentalists who'll be like, "Hey man, it's like all going to be a desert like the Sahara." And it's like, well, you know what? It's not really like that either. The key thing is it's not a tree issue that is the debate when it comes to old growth. It's a habitat or ecosystem issue. The issue is not whether or not trees grow back after you cut down old growth forests. It's a question of whether the ensuing second growth plantations adequately replicate the original old growth forest in terms of species and habitat requirements for those species, in terms of carbon storage, in terms of tourism values, values for First Nations. The question is, are they the same thing? And they're not. So old growth forests, because they have gaps in the canopy where trees have died and fallen down, they let more sunlight through, so you get more well-developed understories. Especially if you go to the western side of Vancouver Island, and you walk through those huge cedar forests with the salal that's over your head, and you bushwhack like that for a day, you sort of feel like you're going crazy. Like, I'm in Nam, man. I'm all like screwed up. It's like a pretty rugged landscape, And then you go through the second growth, and it's like, this is easy peasy. It's because the trees are so close together, they block out the sunlight. And the rotation age actually is diminished on the coast. It used to be about 80 years. Now it's more like 60 years. And even on the private lands, like as low as like 35 years in some places. So you don't get the old growth characteristics unless you have time for the development of those characteristics. Canopy gaps can partly be created through thinning, but you also, in terms of the woody debris, here's like a big dead spruce tree from the Haddocken Lake area near the Walbrand. Some characteristics just take time. You just can't replicate them unless you have centuries. So, the dead, standing and fallen dead wood is home to a lot of different arthropods, salamanders, bigger vertebrates as well. And I know there's somebody here talking about mushrooms. I'll show you a big mushroom picture for you soon. Old growth forests also store 2 to 3 times more carbon per hectare, coastal old growth forests, than the ensuing second growth plantations that they're being replaced with. Now, sometimes you're going to hear, especially in the newspaper, when you hear the Coast Forest Products Industries writing letters where they say that we need to replace these aging old growth forests that barely sequester new carbon with vibrant, fast-growing second growth plantations that store carbon faster. The problem with that argument is it's really a conceptual flaw. And the point being is that when you cut down old growth forests, which store, nobody argues with this, they actually store at any given point in time a lot more carbon, more than 2 times more than the second growth. The carbon is released in the form of decomposing wood waste in the clear cuts, in the form of decomposing wood products in the landfills, in the sewage system, and only about 10% of the carbon is stored in long-lasting wood products, in like furniture and things that last decades. Most of it is returned into the atmosphere within a few short years. And the second growth, even though it grows faster, the rate of sequestration is quicker, it's just trying to get back the carbon that was lost as a result of logging the original old growth. So the it's sort of like, here's the analogy. It's like if your goal is to be as rich as possible, you've got an inheritance of millions of dollars, you have no job, but you've got an inheritance, just like we've inherited huge amounts of carbon tied up in these old growth forests. And then you get a job as a lawyer, so you're making a lot more, then you spend all that money, okay, you blow all your inheritance, and then you get a job as a lawyer, so you're making more money than you were when you didn't have a job. Does it mean you're better off at that point? And no, it doesn't, because the fact is that you had a lot of money, but you just blew it. Just like when you cut the old growth, you lose a lot of the carbon, and even though the second growth grows faster, just like if you have a job as a lawyer, you're making more money more quickly, you're just trying to get back what you lost. So there's the basic idea that replacing old growth with second growth results in a net loss of carbon on the order of 50% or more. And old growth forests are also home to various old growth obligates, as well as species that don't necessarily have to only have old growth, but their populations are highest in old growth, so they flourish best in old growth. So there's the famous marbled murrelet. Are there some murrelets nesting in some parts of the Sunshine Coast here?
Oh, yeah.
Probably, like I know around the sea shelf area, I think Cairn Range is sort of famous for studies, but probably up here, I imagine, at higher elevations, you'll have some.
There's a lot out by Desolation Sound.
Okay. And I don't know up here, but down on Vancouver Island, there's been a lot of research in years past of the soil that builds up underneath the moss mats and the epiphytic plants that grow on the branches of old growth trees. Soil takes a long time to form from decomposition and of vegetation, and so you don't have soil in the canopies of second growth forests. But on the old growth branches of Sitka spruce, as well as in the sort of the pockets in the U-shaped pockets in the old red cedar, scientists at the University of Victoria, Dr. Neville Winchester, Dr. Zoe Lindo, who's now at Western, and Richard Ring previously, have been studying the arthropods, insect spiders and mites, found in the old growth canopies and in the soil and the moss mats up there. And from just 7 giant red cedars and 5 giant Sitka spruce in the Carmana-Walbrand valleys, they've identified over 300 undescribed species to science. That's just a dozen trees, 300 new species. So, and sometimes they're sort of small and ugly, and people ask, what's the point in small, ugly things like this? You never, but the thing is, they all have their niche. They evolve there, they could be food for other things, they themselves can act in important roles as predators or decomposition, they have their own intrinsic value, and many of the lesser known species, and also the creatures that are usually devalued, can turn out to have importance directly for medicine in some cases, like the Pacific yew tree. They found Taxol in the inner bark, so the ugly tree in the older forest here. It was in the late 1980s. They found Taxol that's used to treat breast and ovarian cancer. Oh, here's an awesome creature. What's this? So this is one of my favorite creatures. Like if you've ever seen a weasel, how much energy they have and how fearless they are, like a tiny little weasel, you multiply that by 1,000 times and you get a wolverine. And it's a 65-pound mustelid. And on Vancouver Island, we had a unique subspecies that hasn't been seen since 1992. So it's probably extinct now on Vancouver Island, which is unfortunate because it really is an incredible, charismatic creature. And they evolved to travel huge distances to eat carrion, to basically deer and elk killed by wolves and cougars, because they're not fast enough to catch deer themselves normally. But the female wolverines with pups can't travel the long distances to eat carrion, so they need a small package of stationary meat that they can just dig up and eat. And the only small package of stationary meat on Vancouver Island for the females and babies was the Vancouver Island marmot. But the Vancouver Island marmot almost went extinct by the late 1990s as a result of clear cutting around their alpine colonies. And normally the adolescents will move to other colonies. They walk through the forest, which signals to them, keep going, keep going, keep going, until you reach another alpine colony, and they interbreed. And that movement of individuals between subpopulations, metapopulations, ended up keeping the populations bolstered. But because they ended up settling in the clear cuts adjacent to their alpine colonies, which eventually grew in, and they didn't produce any long-term populations, that is, the clear cuts became population sinks. Eventually the marmot almost went extinct, died off, and was rebred in the Calgary Zoo and reintroduced. There's a few hundred left again around the Comox area. But there was really a period of at least 10 to 15 years with almost no food for the wolverine females and the babies. And basically, they starved to death. And there's an incredible creature that, as a result of excessive logging, essentially has gone extinct. And the spotted owl. Originally, they estimate there were 500 breeding pairs. So that's like 1,000 adults, probably another 1,000 juveniles. By 1990, there were about 200 individuals. By the year 2000, there were about 40 individuals. And today, there's only 10 left in BC's wilds, and 6 in captivity. And this is a species that will probably go extinct in British Columbia within just a few years. And that's because of old growth logging in the lower mainland region. And there's fewer of these guys too. This is a picture I got just a few days ago, actually. And old-timers recall when there were so many Sasquatch the valleys were brimming with them. You could step on their backs, your feet never touch the ground, across the entire valley. Sadly, those days are gone. So these are some places in the southwestern mainland and Vancouver Island that we've been focusing on. This area is Echo Lake near Mission. I'll bet you nobody has been to Echo Lake. Anyone been to Echo Lake? I don't think you have, because the reason this patch of old growth still remains is because private landowners on one side of the valley, there's basically a whole whack of private land here that blocks access to the old growth on this side, on the Crown lands. And it's actually very rugged down on the other side, and they can't get a road up on the other side. So you have this one enclave of low elevation giant red cedars and Douglas firs, which we searched all over those valleys, and we can't find it anymore in the whole Chehalis, Harrison, that sort of eastern Fraser region, except here, in terms of any major stands. And so we were able to get the Ministry of Forests just 2 weeks ago to protect basically this south side here, but they've left out a whole chunk of old growth on the north side here. This is the world's largest night roosting site for bald eagles. You literally have 700 bald eagles roosting in these trees at nighttime during the salmon run some years, and as many as 10,000 bald eagles just adjacent in the Chehalis Harrison River estuary area. So it's actually more lucrative for bald eagles than the Squamish Brackendale area or Haines Junction. There's a little Echo Lake from the bottom, and it looks like tropical Vietnam or something, but it's a really steep mountain. You can see why it's difficult to get the roads in on one side of the lake there. And huge Douglas firs and red cedars. There's only about 1% of these old growth Douglas firs left on the coast here. Huge giant. This is in the territory of the Chehalis First Nations then. So they're calling for the protection of the area. We didn't, actually that's not the best picture, but there's a series of really big moss-covered rocks. Like the entire rock is covered in moss, and it's like the size of a small house with big cedars. There's a section like that with big, giant mossy boulder and huge cedars, one after another. And the bears are totally there. You see they've scratched all the trees there. The skunk cabbage swamp. Yeah, so it's like this is very rare for the lower mainland. Because on Vancouver Island, I'm more accustomed to seeing these type of landscapes, but we searched a lot in lower mainland. There's a lot less. Mears Island. This is a classic behind Tofino. How many have been to Mears Island? Anyone done the Big Trees Trail there? The boardwalk? Okay, so that's probably where the most people, well, after Cathedral Grove, I think this is one of the most popular old growth destinations. I think it attracts about 20,000 people every year. I remember a few years ago, we were taking a little boat with just us and 2 tourists who just came from Tokyo. They saw a brochure to see big trees. And so they came with us on this boat, and the driver's like, you know, taking us through all these little past islands and inlets, and they were like, hey, excuse me, driver, who's on this island we going to? Anyone live on this island that we're going to? Like, just you and the bears. And so he's like, here you go, just gonna drop us off. And they're like from urban Tokyo, right? So you imagine there's like bears everywhere. Every time they turn around, I'm like, whoa, they're like right behind me. But it's definitely one of the funnest trail boardwalks to see big trees. This hanging garden tree is like 21 feet in diameter, and if you go around to the other side, you can go inside, and it can fit like 30 people in there. And there's Flores Island again. Flores Island to me is heaven on earth, because you know when you fly over the southern part of the province, largely it's a patchwork of clear cuts and second growth and some old growth and roads, but this is virtually contiguous, unbroken old growth for like 150 square kilometers. If there's still a Sasquatch, I think his mud hut is on that mountainside there. And this is Cow Bay. This is where all the whale watching is, and then you can hike along these beaches and camp. And actually, a few years ago, when I was in my tent there, there's Cow Bay again. But yeah, in my tent, I thought I heard some noises outside, but I wasn't sure because the ocean's pretty noisy as well. And when I got out in the morning, there was a whole pack of wolves that had been around my tent. Just like the prints all around, just checking me out and like, don't want to eat him. And huge candelabra red cedars on Flores Island. This one we call the Gorgon candle. And this is the trail to Canada's biggest tree, the trail to Chiwat Lake, the Chiwat Cedar. And there's my friend TJ. He's trying to erect this big cedar that fell. He eventually succeeded, but we ran out of film. Digital camera. This is the finest standards red cedars, actually. The first thing you see is this giant fallen tree, and as you continue, you keep coming across other big trees on the way that you think must be the biggest tree in the country. And it turns out, no, they just keep getting bigger. This one's one of the weirdest ones. There's a cave in the middle. This is where she lives there. And this is Canada's biggest tree, the Chiwat Giant. How many people have seen the Chiwat Giant? This is a hard tree to find and to get to, but this tree is 450 cubic meters, like 450 regular size or second growth trees worth of wood in this one tree here. It's like arriving at a small planet when you get there. I think it has its own gravitational field. It's so big. It's amazing that we still have these types of trees in this part of the world. And this is the world's biggest Douglas fir. How many people have seen the Red Creek fir? Anyone been there? So if you go to Port Renfrew, there's a brochure now that we helped produce. It's the Big Trees Tour of Port Renfrew. And right around Port Renfrew, you've got the Red Creek fir, the biggest Douglas fir, 330 cubic meters in this one tree, 13 feet wide and over 200 feet tall. There's a hemlock you see on the side there. It looks like an anaconda. There's also this tree here, the San Juan spruce. It's the biggest spruce tree in Canada, and it's about 330 cubic meters, if I recall. And on the side of the San Juan spruce, which is one of the mossiest, most beautiful trees I've seen, is the hugest agarikon mushroom. Do you see him up there on the? Yeah. If it fell on you, it would kill you. Apparently, I heard that. I mean, there's a guy, Paul Stamets is his name. He's on Cortez, and did a TED talk. I haven't watched it yet, about how the agarikon will save the world. It has lots of immune system boosting properties and various things. There's the Nimitt Canyon near Port Alberni. The Nimitt Valley has some of the finest stands of old growth Douglas firs as well. Anyone been to the Nimitt Valley before? Pretty beautiful area. And there's the Cathedral Grove Canyon. Very few people know about this place, but this is an incredible place just about 3 kilometers upstream along the Cameron River from Cathedral Grove. And yeah, you have this incredible cliff. This is my friend who unfortunately died after this photo here. But you can see like this incredible cliff, and at the bottom, if you were to continue along the bottom, there's actually a huge cave, and a real caveman who lives in there. There's some dude from Port Alberta who discovered this cave, and he's brought down like tons of like old magazines and like, furniture, and he just hangs out in there and drinks beer and stuff. But anyways, this is an incredible natural feature.
Isn't it owned by Island Timberlands?
Yes. So
they're logging it, aren't they?
They proposed to log in 2006, if I recall.
Yeah.
So I know that Island Timberlands is the big company in your area. All over eastern Vancouver Island now, there's conflicts with Island Timberlands. They're one of the biggest exporter of raw logs, and they're also in a whole lot of contentious areas. On Cortez Island, at Stillwater Bluffs over here, at the Day Road Forest near Roberts Creek, Eagle Ridge Bluffs by Shawnigan Lake. The list goes on and on. In fact, we're exploring a place tomorrow that I think is going to be everywhere in the news pretty soon. So for the private lands, okay, this is a longer discussion here, but on the conservation side, we're saying that the province has got to create or reestablish a fund to protect private lands, purchase and protect private lands. Through the 1990s, the NDP had a park acquisition fund, and the Liberals had it for many years, but they nixed it in 2008. And it was a fund that was never big enough, but it was still millions of dollars used to purchase private lands to add to the protected areas system. So we're saying that the province needs to create a $40 million a year fund to purchase private lands to expand the protected areas system. That might sound like a lot, but it's important to remember that the provincial budget is $40 billion a year. So $40 million to invest in our parks is peanuts. It's like, it's not 1%, it's 1/1000th. So it's 0.1% of the provincial budget that would be used to invest in the park system. And they show that for every dollar spent on parks, you get a $9 return in revenues in the surrounding communities when people spend money in the restaurants and gas stations and hotels and so forth. So it's a worthwhile investment, but there's just not enough money for private citizens to raise, to purchase all these contentious areas. On the private lands, we could bring an end to the war in the woods pretty quickly, at least in the old growth sites, because there's very little old growth left on those private lands, if the provincial government kicked in, just like several regional districts have park acquisition funds. The Capital Regional District has a park acquisition fund of about $3 million a year. They've spent about $30 million so far, and they got Jordan River a little while ago, the surfing area. They've got a lot of the Sioux Hills, areas by Thetis Lake, by Mount Work. It's been one of the most greatest conservation success stories. And so we need a provincial equivalent. We used to have a provincial equivalent, but they haven't had it for about 5 years now. So that's one thing you can do, is to get Nicholas Simons is it Simmons or Simons? Simons to commit the incoming NDP government to reestablish the park acquisition fund that the NDP had. And letters really count. And how many people here saw the movie Avatar? It's a pretty awesome movie, I think. I like this movie. So when my friend TJ was exploring an area near Port Renfrew, he came across this monumental stand of huge red cedars that were close to the road, just 5 minutes past the end of the logging road, easy to get to on gentle terrain. And about half a dozen of the trees had really big, incredible burls there. When he took me there a month later, that was in 2010, we just formed the Ancient Forest Alliance. I had left the Wilderness Committee. Then we found falling boundary tape around this area, because he had asked himself, how did this ever get missed? Low elevation, monumental giant cedars close to the road. Turns out that it didn't get missed. Right when he took me there is when we saw the falling boundary tape. So then I set up a Facebook group called Save the Gordon River Valley Grove, Tree Farm License 46 Grove. And I thought, I don't know if that's going to really take off. But that movie, Avatar, is awesome. I'm going to call it the Avatar Grove. And so at first people are like, why would you call it Avatar Grove, yeah, after this Hollywood movie, blah, blah, blah. But it worked because there became huge media interest, and we also discovered Canada's gnarliest tree. So we took people to see this gnarly tree. You can see different faces in there. Elvis, in some cases, people see her. Nightmare Rabbit. There's different Jabba the Hutt. So we took a ton of people to see the area, and the media really caught on. It made the front page of the Globe and Mail, the Vancouver Sun, Times Colonist, and even Al Jazeera. It's like the BBC that comes out of the Middle East. During the Arab Spring, the uprising in Libya, they came out to see what was going on in the battle over Avatar Grove. So you imagine like Gaddafi watching the screen like, wow, that's one gnarly sea there. So what happened is we ended up, as a result of all the letter writing and the rallies and the petitions and the protests, the government established an old growth management area that prohibits logging in the entire Avatar Grove in early 2012. So it is. So that was, but see, Avatar Grove was always the poster child, and the gnarly tree was always the poster child for the bigger campaign to get a systematic plan, provincial legislation to phase out old growth logging in the endangered regions quicker than it'll be phased out by elimination of the logging out the last of them. So we needed another poster child, and we haven't been able to find one. The only thing we found so far is Canada's nuttiest tree. I don't want their photos by this time. What we also have here is TJ, my friend TJ likes to explore these old growth forests. I'd like to do it if I had more time, but I've got to spend my time writing press releases. But he's out there a lot of times photographing and exploring, and he found an incredible grove of these huge trees. This one's called the Gnarly Clark. It's named after Christy Clark, so we call the grove the Christy Clark Grove. And people, at first there were some NDPers who were like, why would you honor Christy Clark by calling this monumental grove after her? It's like, this is an unprotected grove. We're not honoring her. We're putting her on the spot and in the spotlight to have to make a decision. So it's just a way to, nothing yet. Sorry, that's another place. So this area here, we also found a tree. I'm surprised the images in this slideshow, it just got changed, but there's a big Douglas fir, the 9th biggest Douglas fir that's being found, and it's the giant Clark. So we've got a huge Douglas fir that is the 9th biggest, and our goal is to help to spotlight the old growth issue through this grove. And now people ask, what's going to happen to the Clark Grove when it becomes NDP government? It'll be the Dix Grove, be the gnarly Dix and the Dix. Okay, so if you ever watched Lord of the Rings, right? In the second one, these incredible old growth deciduous trees covered in epiphytes and hanging ferns and mosses end up fighting back and destroying the bad guys. So we were exploring in the riparian forests that feed into the streams that feed into Lake Cowichan a while ago, and then we came across this incredible stand of enormous big leaf maples. These maples span as much as 8 feet wide. The biggest ones are 8 feet wide, and apparently Andy McKinnon says they can live to about 400 years. So these are some of the biggest deciduous trees in North America, and they're just covered in mosses and ferns. My understanding it's because of calcium in their bark that seems to stimulate that type of growth. And from top to bottom, you have this is the most photogenic forest I've been in. So we called it Mossy Maple Grove, or the Fanghorn Forest, after the Lord of the Rings. It really looks like the forest of the Fanghorn. And we've been working with the Hulkamenium Treaty Group with Robert Morales and Roseanne Daniels. He's the chief treaty negotiator for the Hulkamenium. They have a land use plan, which was through a combination of several land use planners, conservation biologists, archaeologists, and community input. that calls for protection of the remaining old growth in their territories. Now, I think their situation is quite similar to the Sunshine Coast. You're looking at like just 2-3% old growth in a lot of those areas. But certainly this is one of the more unique parts of old growth that still remain in their territory. And we're working wherever we can with First Nations to protect old growth forests. In some places, First Nations want to log contentious old growth forests. In other places, they have land use plans that call for protection of old growth forests. So we support First Nations rights and title. We work with First Nations to see implementation of land use plans to protect old growth. We will also disagree with First Nations governments, just like we can disagree with the British Columbian government and the Canadian government and governments around the world if they want to undertake anti-environmental proposals in some cases. So there's Joe Martin speaking back in the early 1980s in the protests for Mears Island. Joe Martin, a few people I think know Joe, but he's a pretty incredible historic figure. Like the protests for saving old growth forests on Vancouver Island began really in the battle for Clayoquot and Mears Island in the early 80s. And Joe was a Tlalopiat fellow, is a master canoe carver. He's now on band council. And he started organizing those protests back then. He will be speaking at our big rally on March the 16th. I'll explain more about the rally coming up, but we want to see if we can get people throughout the coast to come on the Saturday for our big rally, and Joe will be a keynote speaker. I want to really, recognize this individual as somebody who's really shown in history to create a better world. And some of the bark stripping near the Nididat, First Nations use cedar bark for so many different things, including clothing historically, which is interesting because most of the country was animal furs, but here it was tree bark, the inner bark of the. And we've also been working a lot with forestry workers. So this is Ken James. Ken James is the president of the Yubo Timberless Society. Yubo Timberless Society formed from the mill workers from the Yubo sawmill that closed down when Timber West shut down the mill in the year 2000, throwing hundreds of workers out of work. But they continued the same rate of cut. But they just were exporting the raw logs to the U.S. and to Asia. And so Ken, he made an alliance, actually the first one to make an alliance with the tree huggers to start turning out the rank and file workers to the rallies that we organized, and we also supported them as well. And so we came up with a common plan, and it was protect the old growth forests immediately in the places most endangered, but with the graduated phase out quickly in other areas, ensure sustainable second growth forestry, end raw log exports, and ensure that there is now it's not an immediate ban, mind you, right, because they've closed down so much of the milling capacity. If you shut down all raw log exports immediately, you eliminate like half or 2/3 of the industry. So it's about regulations and incentives to build up the value added and the milling capacity as well at the same time. But we need to bring an end to log exports quickly, just like we need to bring an end to old growth logging, certainly on the southern parts, through a systematic plan, as opposed to just letting it all happen as you watch it happen, where you lose the old growth forests, and you lose the second growth, and you lose the jobs, because they haven't invested in the second growth milling capacity. In the year 2001, Dr. Peter Pierce from UBC put out a report that stated that in 10 years' time, if there weren't about a dozen large mills on the coast that handled second growth logs, then we'd see a mass exodus of raw logs leaving the province. And lo and behold, it's more than 10 years later, and there's only one large second growth mill. It's the J.S. Jones mill in Surrey, and a couple mid-sized mills. But we don't have a dozen large mills to handle the maturing second growth. And our position is not just 2x4s, but going further up the value-added chain. And so there's different ways to do that. The federal NDP, Gene Crowder, the MP for Cowichan, had made the proposal for essentially tax credits for investment in value-added facilities. In the United States, the industry in the 1990s had retooled the old growth mills to second growth. So I believe that there also needs to be a major retooling of the old growth mills. and the government can provide an incentive system through tax credits. Or Bob Simpson, he's the independent MLA, is proposing that there be a fund created through an increased tax on raw log exports that would then go towards bolstering the value-added sector for those who invest in second growth manufacturing. It could be, for example, to assist with marketing of value-added products in different ways. In the year 2003, the BC Liberal government introduced the Forestry Revitalization Act. And the idea was that if they eliminated they would revitalize the forest industry if they eliminated the milling requirements for the companies that had TFLs, that had logging rights, tenure on a lot of the coast, because the mills were getting old and inefficient. And that would somehow revitalize the industry. So what's happened over time? It hasn't been anything but that. There's been about 75 of those mills have shut down. The employment base dropped from about 80,000 to about 55,000, I think it was, 85 to 55. And you still, the forest industry has taken a bit of a recovery based on the new Chinese markets, which I think are going to be problematic in the future with expanded log exports as they shift away from lumber imports towards log imports is where I think they're going to go. But there certainly hasn't been any grand revitalization of the industry. If anything, it's gone the opposite way. The elimination of the local milling requirements, or the appurtency, created the circumstances where there was no pressure on the companies to have to retool for as the second growth profile began to increase. And what's happened is not that they haven't logged as much. They're logging as fast as they ever have, but they have been of that maturing second growth, but they've just been exporting it now. So that's one place where the log exports are coming from, is the maturing second growth, where in some places you don't have the milling capacity to handle those logs. Now the other place where you have log exports happening a lot of is from the hemball stands, hemlock and Madelis fir. Those generally are a little bit higher elevation. As farther north you go, you get more of it. The really productive old growth forest that you found in the valley bottoms with the really big spruce trees, Douglas firs, red cedar, a lot of that now is gone. The high productivity old growth is only a minuscule fraction of what it used to be. And as you go to these mid-elevation slopes and you get the smaller trees and the smaller species, they haven't invested a lot of the milling capacity for that in some cases. And so they are also exporting that. But there are mills that can take a lot of these. Now that's where the politics gets complicated, and there's a lot of policy discussion on that. But the idea here is that many mills say that they can take those logs, but they don't dare to make an offer for the logs, because on the Crown lands, the companies with tenures have to first offer those logs for a bidder from a BC mill, and if there's no bid, then they can export it to other countries. So in theory, all the logs being exported are surplus to local needs. But when you talk to different mill owners and guys in the industry, many of them say that because there's such corporate concentration in the industry, there's basically, like Western Forest Products controls the vast majority of Vancouver Island's Crown lands, and then it's Island Timberlands and formerly Timber West, now it's the pension funds that have the private lands. Because there's relatively few sources of the logs, many of the mills don't want to bid on those logs if they know the companies with tenure want to export them for a higher price in the US or in Asia. Because if they do bid against and block the ability of the company to export that wood, then they won't get future agreements, long-term agreements to get a consistent log supply, which is what they really need in the future. So it's the corporate concentration and the relatively few tenure holders is one reason that I've heard from many mill owners and union, CEP actually, and some of the PPWC guys, that is one of the problems, is that you have basically a bullying that goes on the side of the tenure holders who say, don't bid on this, because if you do, we don't do business in the future. Because there are fewer options. Now, a few more nuances of the whole thing. Okay, also with the United States, with the softwood lumber dispute, because there's so much demand in the U.S. For wood, and they also have a lot of mills down there. They actually did retool their old growth mills to second growth in the 90s in Oregon, Washington. They also have a big demand for logs. So there's a tariff on BC lumber coming into the U.S., but no tariff on the raw logs. So that's also another reason for a big flow of raw logs into the U.S. What are some other reasons? Well, we'll talk more about this. Let's go through a few of these. So what we did a little while ago, this is a few years ago, we have a friend, Nick, who lives in an apartment with big windows overlooking the Surrey docks. And on the Surrey docks, you could see all the raw logs being loaded. So we asked if we could set up a web camera in his apartment and upload the video feed onto our website to show everyone all the BC logs and BC jobs being exported. So he agreed, and the next day we checked after setting it up, we checked our website and we could see this video feed. We're like, oh, excellent. And then we checked again at nighttime. The only thing we could see on our website, on our web camera at night, was Nick walking around his apartment. Why is Nick walking around the web camera? And it's because when it was dark outside and light in his apartment, his big glass windows became like big mirrors. For God's sake, Nick, don't do anything embarrassing. Don't remove your clothes or anything. You're on the web camera. So it became Nick's raw log web camera. So move the camera outside the window. Okay, so this is here's the giant Clark, actually. That's the 9th biggest Douglas fir in the Christie Clark Grove. Yeah, seems to be the giant. So if you want to know why there's been a 20-year decline in coastal forestry in British Columbia, the fundamental reason, and this was pointed out in Peter Pierce's report in 2001, is because of the high-grade overcutting and depletion of the biggest, best trees in the valley bottoms. That's the fundamental driver of this 20-year decline. And it's really the constraints that the industry is facing. They always complain about the limitations and constraints that they face are not parks and environmentalists and hippies chained to their logging trucks. It's fundamentally driven by depletion of the biggest, best trees in the lower elevations. And you can see that with all the stats that are coming out. Now, you're going to see some discrepancies between the government stats and our stats when you see how much old growth remains. And the reason why is what the governments are doing when they put out their press releases is they include the low productivity old growth, like hundreds of millions of hectares of this in their statistics to make it look like old growth forests are not endangered anymore. In fact, Pat Bell, the former Minister of Forests, even said a couple of years ago that we have more old growth forests today in British Columbia than we've ever had. A century of industrial logging has increased the amount of old growth in this province. We're doing the wrong thing. We should be logging to increase old growth. Huh? So this is the fundamental reason. It's high-grade resource depletion. And so at this point in time now, with most of southern British Columbia, second growth now, and increasingly second growth, we're saying there's got to be a systematic plan beyond our existing old growth management area plan, which is insufficient to protect what remains. And that's not to say that in some areas you can't make an exception to have like an old growth logging reserve to turn out some really high value logs in some cases, because old growth wood is the best for value added. But is a predominant part of the landscape just because it's being hammered so heavily now. At this point in time, we can do what the rest of the world is doing, which is logging second, third growth forests and leave the old growth alone. So it's a story that needs to be told. It's the unsustainable resource depletion results in not only the collapse of ecosystems, but in collapse of rural employment. And that's what we've seen in these forestry-dependent communities. I heard actually, Murray was telling me today that at one time there was like thousands of forestry workers in this town, and the mill is what, 350 people now? I mean, it's in Port Alberni as well. It used to have, along with Powell River at different times, like the highest per capita income of any town in Canada at one time in the 70s. And that was based on the green gold, the huge old Douglas firs and Sitka spruce in the valley bottoms of that era, just like 40, 50 years ago. And then it was ranked a couple of years ago as like the second worst place in the country to live. I remember the mayor was complaining about this assessment of his town, but you know, it's what's happened over time as resource depletion kicks in. So what we do is we organize tours through we explore different areas. There's the Gordon River Valleys coming back, and we look for big trees. We organize a lot of hiking trips. There's the refugee tree. It's the biggest red cedar in the Capital Regional District around Victoria. And my friend PJ, he found this tree just in 2008. We work with the Chamber of Commerce in Port Renfrew. This Chamber of Commerce became a champion of saving the avatar growth. So my belief is that social change is fundamentally driven by large numbers of people and many different kinds of people. So a lot of times, your typical activist is going to get the small group of rowdy, strident lefties and tree huggers and protesters. That's a small fraction of society. Even in the best of circumstances, like in British Columbia or Victoria, you're going to have maybe 15% of the population as the sort of hardcore progressives. But it's not enough to fundamentally transform society. So the real task, I believe, as people who want to make a better world, is to get other people who are not like you to take a shared stance. It means also listening and learning and changing some of your views as well to create common ground, but keeping your core principles intact. And from there, you push together. So we worked a lot with the tourism businesses in the Port Renfrew Souk area to save old growth forests. It's a Chamber of Commerce here that asked the Ancient Forest Alliance, the protesters, to help them raise money for a tourist info center. So that's what we did. And we had Phillips beer, Phillips Brewing here, make an Ancient Forest Alliance beer for us. The $10,000 we raised through this Ancient Forest Ale. It sold out in like 10 days.
Yeah, it's great.
And we organize a lot of small rallies and big ones as well. So there's the UBC students, hands off the old growth banner there. This is a spotted owl at UVic. And we have a big rally coming up on March the 16th. And this rally here is actually when I was still at the Wilderness Committee. We organized a rally that turned out 3,000 people, including hundreds of workers from the Crofton and the Harmac mills, calling jointly for protection of old growth, sustainable second growth forest industry, an end to raw log exports, and a government incentive and regulation program to support second growth milling and value-added industry. So, you know, this coming March the 16th, we have key First Nations leaders. We've got some of the forestry union leaders, the Chamber of Commerce as well, John Cash. Johnny Cash is going to be there. This is me. He's the vice president. Actually, it's funny, in Port Renfrew, there's a guy, John Cash, and then there's also Tom Jones, who's also a bunch of guys. And then there's Rob Stewart as well. So we, last time 3,000 people, and right now we've got pre-confirmed 1,000 people on our website and Facebook. And last time we had about 20 people who came down from Powell River, I remember. They were singing a song about island timberlands, and there was some controversy here a few years ago. I don't know, it was the Eagle River or somewhere around here. There was a big fight about old growth with island timberlands. So anybody who can come, it would be awesome if you can make this. This would be historic. And we're going to do ring around the legislature, encircle the government building several times. Anyone who's got kids, we're going to have a small animals parade where kids can dress up as mirrolets, owls, bears, cougars, mini Sasquatch. Batman and Robin support us as well. They just showed up. The avatars support us too. It's our first rally a couple of years ago. We're only 3 years old, but time is running out. This is one of the big red cedars. These type of monumental groves now are coming to an end. Now the Ministry of Forests is coming up now with a plan to protect the biggest trees and monumental groves. There's a new legal tool that they're developing, and we're hoping it's going to be ambitious, and I suspect they're probably going to trot it out before the election. Now that'll be a good thing to protect the biggest trees. We need that if they go ahead with it, but more importantly, it's the ecosystem. Big trees are sort of a flagship, but it's not the fundamental thing that really counts. It's the ecosystem that counts, and sustaining value-added, sustainable forestry jobs in the second growth at the same time. But you know, at this point in time now, in the southern jurisdictions, the southern parts of the province, it's time to give old growth logging a rest now. Just like if there's too few deer in certain game units or too few trout in certain streams, it makes sense that you have a deer hunting closure or a trout fishing closure in those areas. Similarly, in the areas of the province where old growth, you're literally looking at 5%, 2%, 7%. In a lot of these areas, it's time to put an end to that old growth logging in those areas. And there's an inevitable transition fully into second growth in the near future. Let's do that sooner rather than later. We found this unhappy guy in the stump afterwards. All exposed afterwards. And this is Keith Martin, actually. He was the Liberal MP who, in his last year before he retired, became a raging tree hugger, and which is an awesome thing. He actually started off as a Reform Party MP, then switched over to the Liberals, and then became an Ancient Forest Alliance tree hugging campaigner. But this red cedar was cut in 2010, 16 feet across. That's the biggest one that we've found that was just cut recently. And this one here in the Walbrand was 15 feet across, cut in 2009. And it's probably the most famous picture that TJ took it's actually used in this cover of a documentary about the Earth Liberation Front, which we're not involved with, but they use this photo here. It's just the logging by the ancient, near the Avatar Grove. So those are 2 websites, but we actually have a third website. And here's a website I want you to remember, because we need everybody here to sign up on it to send a message to the NDP and the Liberals. It's bcforestmovement.com. bcforestmovement.com. And we've already had about 2,100 people send messages in the last 1 week calling on the NDP, who are going to be the next government in all likelihood, and the BC Liberals to commit to a forestry overhaul. This is a time in history where I believe that we can have a greater, bigger vision that keeps what makes us special, these incredible 1,000-year-old ancient forests, and have a vibrant, sustainable forest industry. Or we can repeat history and go down the path of resource depletion, ecosystem collapse, and loss of forestry jobs. So we're at a juncture. And the BC Liberals right now, they haven't changed tune. So they're basically saying old growth forests are not endangered. They're going to keep trotting out statistics, unless they change tunes fast, that includes all the low productivity to say there's lots of old growth everywhere, it's not endangered. And the NDP are sort of in a very careful slumber, kind of like, you know, just open your eyes once in a while to see if we're still looking at them. And they want to try to cruise into the next election without making any commitments. There's nothing visionary and nothing that, you know, dramatically moves us from the unsustainable status quo in their platform yet. But it can happen. It requires that people speak up and put pressure both on Adrian Dix and on Nicholas here, and who I think is quite a green sort of guy. My sense is his thinking leans in that way. So if you can send a message to bcforestmovement.com, and whoever can come, if you can come out to our rally on March 16th, you'd have to come Friday night, have some friends, and stay over in Victoria probably, unless you can get an early ferry. I don't know how early the ferries are from here. Also we have posters. You can stick a few up there at the back there. Stick a few up in town. And there's little handbills there as well. And we've got a sign-up sheet here. So thank you very much.
On behalf of Powell River Voices, I'm Rob Southdown. On behalf of Powell River Voices, the Sierra Club, and the unions, I'd like to thank you very much for a fascinating and insightful presentation about this environment and a business that I think is of crucial concern to all of us here. Our communities are progress into the future, and hopefully in the direction of prosperity, both environmentally and economically. I'm absolutely sure that there are comments and questions. I just ask that you put up your hands or a finger. I'd like to select people in order and stay concise. Keep a question to a single question, please. And I'll just open the floor to questions and comments. After that, there's coffee and snacks, and I'm sure some of us would love to stick around and discuss this.
Hey, Rob, maybe just before I forgot to mention, they are looking for donations at the door to help pay for costs. I should have mentioned that first, but on your way out, if you didn't get a chance to drop something in there, if you can on your way out, that'd be great.
Thank you.
And it's really hard to be in small organizations to raise enough funds, so definitely do that, everyone.
I should have really mentioned that. Wes?
Yes, could you explain to us what the so-called private lands are and how they became controlled by island timberlands, and who owns island timberlands, and who owns Western Forest Products, and how this all happened?
Okay, I'm not familiar on the Sunshine Coast, but I do know most of the
private
private
everywhere in the province, is it not?
Well,
What are the private lands, and how did they become controlled by island timberlands?
okay, so on the southeastern part of Vancouver Island, it's where most of the private lands in the province are. That area is largely owned by Island Timberlands, and just until recently by Timber West. That was part of the E&N land grant back in the 1880s or 1890s, where, or maybe even early 1870s, there was a guy, Robert Dunsmuir, who, in exchange for creating a railway from Victoria to like Comox, he was given all this land. And over the years, that land, which was sold off to different companies, became concentrated into two big companies. On the Sunshine Coast, I don't know what the history of private lands is on the coast, but I do know that Island Timberlands and Western Forest Products are largely owned by Brookfield Assets Management, which is, I think it's based in Bermuda now or something, to avoid, to avoid some sort of legal ramifications.
But is that's not the whole story. There's a real dirty story here, right? And we're not hearing it.
For tree farm licenses?
For private lands, the crown grants that existed all over the province that were privately owned, that weren't part of crown land, over the years became owned by forest companies, and then they were put into the tree farm licenses, were they not?
Yeah,
well, they were controlled somewhat, and they couldn't be cut willy-nilly, and the trees couldn't be exported at will. And then something happened, and that forest land that was so-called private, that we call it private, was given to Brascan, right? Brascan is Brookfield. Well, somehow they were given that land, and now we're desperately trying to buy that land back so we can protect a few trees. But the story about how it was given away has never told to people. We don't know about it.
The Liberals.
Yeah, well,
I know, but why don't you tell us a story?
Sure, okay.
Tell the story to us.
Yeah, so there's two things here. Okay, so you have tree farm licenses, the logging tenures on the crown lands, and you also have private lands that were previously regulated as if they were crown lands, as if they were public lands. So in the 1940s, when they were granting tree farm licenses, they said that we will give you rights to log on these crown lands for free if you also agree to two things. One of them is to include your private lands, which you own, in the tree farm license so that it can be regulated by the government, and then allocate the timber there into local mills. So it was called appurtency, or so the local milling requirement. So that way you would have a bigger area of timber that was regulated for creating, for the public good, for jobs in milling. And subsequently, especially in the 1990s, there became more and more environmental laws that came in as a result of the NDP as well, that also regulated more of the forestry. Not enough, but it started to move that way. When the BC Liberals came to power, well, actually, it started with the NDP, to tell you the truth. It was the biggest chunk of deregulation actually happened with the NDP around 1998. They took out about 300,000 hectares of Timber West's private lands from the tree farm license, but they required that the company give back something in return. So there's a whole bunch of protected areas that were created as a result of that deregulation, and there's a few other requirements. So, but you know, I don't think it was quite enough, in my opinion. Now, when the BC Liberals came to power, starting in 2004, they allowed for island timberlands. Actually, at that time it was Weyerhaeuser, to remove 90,000 hectares of their lands, largely on Vancouver Island, but a little bit on the Sunshine Coast here as well, from the tree farm license. And after that, in 2007, I believe, or 2006, 2007, it was Western Forest Products, and that was the big fight around Jordan River and down the surfers all up in arms. So what happened is once they deregulated all those lands, the general restriction on raw log exports no longer applied, as well as the prohibition against building residential development in those areas. And the old growth management areas, the ungulate winter ranges, all those type of environmental protections also disappeared. A lot of the fights you're seeing right now on Vancouver Island, at McLaughlin Ridge and Port Alberni, the Cameron Firebreak, I mean, a whole whack of these areas were formerly protected through public lands regulations on those private lands, because like the key thing is that the companies got free rights to log on Crown lands originally on condition that they would have local milling and that these lands would be regulated for public good. And the Liberals allowed the removal of those tree farm licenses, and the companies didn't have to pay anything in return. So the NDP did require compensation from the company, the Liberals didn't. But that's a recent history from about 1998 to 2007 is the era of massive deregulation of the private lands. Now, there's other categories of private lands that were not in the tree farm licenses. I don't think it was all within tree farm licenses here on the Sunshine Coast, but some of it was. But the key thing is when people say you can't regulate private lands, it's because it's their land. And you know, we say, bullshit, they regulated it for 50 years. It was publicly regulated. It is possible to do. Just as, for example, in the, I don't know about here if it's a big deal, but in some parts of Vancouver Island, you're seeing a conversion of forests into suburban sprawl and building developments and so forth. And just like we have a agricultural land reserve, I believe we need a forest land reserve that would keep forest lands within forestry use. Also, the lands that were where the tree farm licenses were removed and there was all those old growth areas that are now open for logging, like McLaughlin Ridge, government's got to move forward with a park acquisition fund. Now, you know, you can take an extreme ideal position, which is, what? This is all ultimately was people's land, and this was given away in the 1890s. It was unceded First Nations territory, so the government should just expropriate the land. And you know, in the ideal world, you could say that, but it's not going to happen. So you got to figure out some viable mechanism to actually save the key areas. And we're saying a park acquisition fund is an important thing. We used to have one; they got rid of it. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, can I hear more about your vision for reforming the forest policy? What you'd like to see the new NDP government?
Some of the key things.
Yeah.
There's a whole. I mean, there's a lot of different aspects there. But okay, you know, on the old growth side, the key area for the old growth is that there needs to be. What they did in the Great Bear Rainforest is they had an scientific risk assessment of if you have this much old growth, this is how much risk you have of losing all these species at different levels. There needs to be that type of scientific risk assessment for each biogeoclimatic zone, each region. And once that's set, then we have to partition the allowable annual cut, how much they're allowed to cut every year between old growth and second growth. And they need to have timelines that phase out the old growth logging and not necessarily ramp up the second growth logging, mind you, because there's a total level of overcut going on in a lot of the province. But there has to be that distinction made. And then they add all of those areas into old growth management areas of protection over time. That's on the old growth side. On the for sustainable forestry, the Forest and Range Practices Act is still in a lot of ways, still deficient for ensuring sustainable forestry. We'd like to see stronger riparian habitat protections, identified wildlife management areas, the stronger biodiversity guidelines. When it comes to the allowable annual cut, it's just too high. They're cutting too much too fast, and you've got to go down on that. And when it comes to the development of a value-added sector, it does require carrots and sticks. It's not going to happen by itself. So it means you got to have incentives like the NDP's tax credit program, or Bob Simpson's fund that comes from the tax, increasing taxes on log exports, as well as the regulations, because under constraint, also companies will be forced to innovate too. Those are some of the key elements.
Just to note, it is possible to discuss the AAC for your local logging, for your local crown land. We intervened with the review for block 1 here, and it was reduced in the last AAC. If you engage in discussion with the chief forester and write letters, things can happen. So,
Just a quick question about it. What old growth is there in this area besides Stillwater that people are focused on?
there's a block of CWHXM above Powell Lake, which a little bit's in Ogma. A lot of it's been untouched. It's probably about, 60 hectares. Not many people know about it. And on public land, probably the largest piece left in the whole George Basin. There's some in Confederation Park. There's all the high stuff that you've mentioned, the yellow cedar and stuff like that. But
Does anyone know a place called Homesite Creek? Someone told me near Half Moon Bay.
Yeah, home site's down in the bottom end,
Yeah.
that's quite nice.
There's like some big firs there. Apparently.
But coastal Douglas fir, no, there isn't any large stuff. There's a small grove just north of London, at the head of a little rivulet. Up there, there's about 18 trees that are original growth.
18 trees.
18, 20 trees.
Save the tree.
That hasn't been touched yet. Other people know other stuff I can't think off the top of my head. There's patches down on the Parker Range. There's, bits and pieces here and there.
Yeah, really close by, it really amounts to just along riparian zones, places that most people never get to, don't know about.
2 points. One is, have you ever investigated, or has anybody ever investigated the relationship of the lobbies that are causing these stupid decisions to be made? Because I think that's the root of the problem. I mean, trying to get legislation passed is one thing, but I think that's more of a symptom. But really, how are all these decisions being made? Have you ever looked at investigating what the relationship between the lobby groups for the forest industry and the marketing people is with the government? And I'm talking about going as deep as you can possibly go. I mean, we know that a lot of shenanigans went on with the whole BC Rail and little bureaucrats in Victoria. There's probably no difference in what's going on with the forest industry. The second point is that if you accept that you've got to go out there and demonstrate an ecological relationship between old growth forests and ecosystem and species loss everywhere that you find it, they basically sent you on a really, really long rabbit trail. If that relationship was established in the Great Bear Rainforest, that should be enough scientific evidence to demonstrate that the same ecological principles apply in every one of those locations, and all you have to do is come up with a few relationships to confirm that tie-in. Otherwise, you're never going to get it done.
Yes.
So you can't accept it.
So, yeah, I agree that one of the key things to do is to push for electoral reform, electoral finance reform, where you can't have corporate donations. That's one of the most blatant parts of the province, which still blows me away, is that you can crank out hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars to a political party to fund their election. Most of the world, a good deal of the world, that's just illegal. Even the Christian government put an end to that, actually, just a few years ago. Heartbreaking is going to slowly creep it back in. So I agree with that. I think it's Integrity BC. There's some organization working on that issue. And then but in terms of the scientific assessment in the Great Bear Rainforest, that could be done across the province, within a few months. It doesn't require that, but it gives the basis to then make the argument, the case that we've got to save the old growth in these areas. Otherwise, it's just me, the protesters saying it. Once you get the people who study these ecosystems saying it, that is the foundation for then the next move is legislation.
Just one, first of all, I said the gentleman back there was talking about burden of proof and these kinds of policy and legislative changes. I think you're on a very good track with that. If we could just get more of a response to freedom of information requests from the Clark government for all that's going to last, we might achieve something on that angle. There was a news item on the radio just today about that, by the way. And if you decide to run for office, I won't, you've got my I did want to ask a question. I think you mentioned, Ken, a website, a third website, kind of to support letter writing to the provincial parties.
BCForestMovement.com.
That was it. Thank you very much.
Could somebody send that out on V8A?
I have a question. I used to live outside of Sequoia National Park for many, many years. And one of the things you realize is there's an enormous amount of interest from the public to see these big trees and so on. Now, you've done a wonderful job with the avatar thing, and that's sort of become almost like a tourist attraction. I mean, it's not the same thing as Cathedral Row. But do you have a whole list throughout all areas that you'd like to see, really identified and saying this is an area, this could be a park where the tourists could come and see these trees and stick a name to it, and so that it becomes, not just saving every old growth, which is perfectly legitimate, but people often think, oh yes, Avatar, we can identify with that, or 10 other areas that this is that you want to work on that can you also identify and become a tourist attraction. And this is, people want to see these big trees.
Well, it's like the places that we highlight are the best of what remains because it's valley bottom and relatively easy to go through. Most of the old growth, I mean, Russ will know this well, these are rugged landscapes. Like most of it is on really steep slopes, higher elevations, and you're not going to, walk through there with just the entire spectrum of the population, unless you're going to have 20% mortality rates. A lot of labor forms, right? So it's only a few places where you can actually have this type of, those types of tourist attractions. But at one time, we used to have a ton of this valley bottom ancient forest, but we go up and down looking for them everywhere, and they're just not there anymore. In most places, it's just a few pockets left. So those are the ones that I'm hoping that the BC government's big trees and monumental groves legal tool will encapsulate. If they want to make a win that will bolster tourism, that's one way to do it, is to get the pockets. Up in Prince George, there's an area called Ancient Forest east of Prince George, and it's become super popular up there. I haven't been there myself, but it's big cedars just east of town.
I worked in that piece, and it's awesome. There's trees, there's cedars there as big as there are in Vancouver Island.
Yeah,
totally,
that whole inland
the
rainforest.
centers are gone. They're all branched out. I didn't even know if that still exists or not. I'm surprised that you mentioned it.
Yeah, we need so I mean those are pretty and they're important ecologically, but the bigger picture is the ecosystem. It's the bigger law that.
I think the root of the problem is in Powell River, actually, in British Columbia, because I think we have one of the most loose forest districts in the whole province, and that's evident in the fact that there is hardly any large growth forest left here, and I think that still prevails. I think people are still, Timber West got kicked out of Haida Gwaii, and that's why they're up in the mountains back there getting all the big trees. So we're just sleeping on it, basically.
once you get to mid and upper elevations, in a lot of the province, you'll still have quite a bit of old growth. But these are areas, they're not sort of what I show in the images, because you just have lots of hemlocks that are like this big, you know. That's most of the old growth, and that's an important ecosystem. It's not the really visually spectacular ones, and the really biologically rich areas are in the lower elevations as well. But once you get higher up, you get that rugged sort of landscapes of hemball, they call it hemlock and atlas fir. There's still quite a bit of that. But just as they fish down the food chain, right, where you took the biggest, best fish and you grow down smaller and smaller, and you lose jobs the whole way, the hemlock, like cedar used to be, you talk to some of these old loggers, they're like, nobody wants cedar. But you're still thinking from the 70s, they definitely want cedar now. But they would remember back in the 70s where it was like a lower value species. And so just like they finished off the big spruce and Douglas firs, and then they moved on to the cedars, the hemlocks are next in line. And apparently it's China that is looking at these or increasing demand now for the hemball.
Is there any way that you know of tracking through timber marks where the specific lumber goes? I've spent some time trying to do that, and I've tried contacting Western Wilderness and no answers.
Yeah,
you don't know of any way of doing that.
There's a couple of detective type guys I know who do that, but.
How do you do that? When we used to tow logs, or I used to tow logs, and we used to take the same logs and move them back and forth up and down the coast, keep the price up until the torpedoes got in, and then put them in the river. So I don't know how you do that. So it's obviously manipulated.
No, it would depend on the sales. The government would keep a record of the sales.
Yeah,
no, I know. So that's where you
yeah, but even
once
I'm just
it's in
saying
the river.
base end of the thing is,
Yeah.
Just had a question. You been here before, Powell River, or?
Geez, to Stillwater just a little while ago. But actually, many years ago, I remember Jeremy.
I'm just wondering, nobody said anything about building a beach trail, right? There's a couple big trees in there, and it's accessible for people. And, tourism. You're talking about tourism, right? You want to promote that kind of stuff, and so people can see they can walk down beach trails and see actually the history of logging here in Powell River. We've got something like that. So, and that the second question was, what do you know about these offshore, like floating plywood manufacturing plants? You know anything about that?
I've never heard about that.
That I've been hearing about. They just bring the logs there, the logs go in, they make the plywood right there, and then they ship it back to us. That way they don't have to ship it all the way across seas and that.
Really? I've never heard about
Anything about that?
Big ships. Google that.
So they save on shipping costs as well, and then all the other laws, right?
Could you explain the timeline, like for second growth? Just to give you an idea of what I'm driving at is, I pick mushrooms, and we're always looking for new spots because one spot gets logged and another one gets found out, whatever. But I found a spot where 60-year-old trees, and we found that the mushrooms are being reestablished there, and lo and behold, here they come and they log it again. Now that's 60 years old, 60 to 70-year-old trees. So what is the optimum sort of time limit for the second growth?
Well, it depends on what your goal is. They say that the old growth characteristics start coming in around the 140-year range,
Yeah.
and these 250 is technically, if you, and these are arbitrary designations, but 250 is the old growth for the coast. But actually, it's crazy to say that a 200-year-old stand is not old growth. So these are, it's a gray area, it's subjective. But in terms of mushrooms, though, I imagine the old growth must have more mushrooms, but I haven't studied mushrooms.
Yeah, what I was trying to get at is because they're taking 60 or 80-year-old trees, is there not another way of putting another bracket in there, having old growth, second growth, and an intermediate sort of piece in there?
Yeah, well, I definitely, we know that as the forest gets older, the wood quality goes higher as well.
Yeah.
I think it's Ray Travers. He used to work for the Ministry of Forests for a long time, and then he ran the Eco-Forestry Institute. He showed me a bunch of papers that I didn't have a chance to totally read them all, but showing that basically at the 110-year stand age in dense coastal stands, you can get the tight rings that develop similar to old growth if the stand is quite dense, where you can get sort of like one plank of quality wood out of those stands. But it doesn't have the old growth characteristics yet, 110 years really. So you'd want to wait longer if your goal is the ecosystem. But if you're talking about higher quality wood, you can do it apparently at the 110-year range.
Claudia?
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. One of them was, you mentioned a brief mention in your talk around the sort of future of exports to China. And I had read that there had actually been another port opened up to accept raw logs specifically. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that in terms of like how that factors into trying to push for legislation to limit or minimize raw log exports when there's sort of it seems like, more of an opening up to accept them. I think they were also talking about they had changed their regulations around how they accept the logs based on possible infestations or something like that. I'm not sure.
Oh, the phytosanitary.
Yeah, I thought that they had actually made them easier or made them more lax. But so that's one thing. Is just I'm thinking in terms of strategies, but how do we deal with more demand, right? And just wrapping my head around that. If you have any insights on that, and then the other is you also mentioned carbon sequestration. I just read another article recently that said that there have been more studies verifying that old growth trees are incredible carbon sinks, and that we need to really consider that in terms of looking at how we reduce our carbon, or how do we actually play that into the numbers game. And I'm wondering as well, like it just seems like a real kind of obvious one, like how you could use the argument, we need to keep those trees standing, if anything, on just that idea of carbon sequestration. And yet I don't really hear that a whole lot. So, and I know that there's nebulous kind of facts around that really, in some views, not in my view, but I just wonder, a lot of that to me is around strategy, like how do you have those conversations that push, write the letters in a certain way that tie in a lot of these things together, so you're looking at both economy and science and climate change, all those pieces together, and then of course ecology. Because to me it seems like there's all kinds of fronts, right, that are attached to all this. So I wonder if you can really talk about it.
Yeah, so when it comes to China, like right now they're importing huge amounts of lumber and raw logs. And I was in China a couple of years ago. There's actually a massive middle class in many areas that's developed in the last 10 years. It's sort of like if even 5% of 1.4 billion people are middle class, that's like bigger than Canadian middle class. So it's a major area. So there's a huge demand for lumber. But my belief, if you look at the history of what China's done, maybe it's going to change. It won't be like this, but I believe it will be. Is that they're going to over time develop their own milling capacity with a lot cheaper labor, and they're going to be interested largely in the raw logs. And what I do notice in China is very quickly they get manufacturing capacity up and running, and they move whole neighborhoods of like thousands of people when they want the land as well. It's a pretty incredible country right now for rapid industrialization, and one of the big issues you might have heard about recently is the Hupachesit First Nations have launched a lawsuit against the federal government for their proposal to establish the Canada-China Free Trade Agreement, or the Foreign Investor Promotion and Protection Agreement. And the concern partly is around land use issues, being able to settle treaties on lands that Island Timberlands wants to log, as well as around raw log exports is a concern. And okay, the way this works is the Chinese Investment Corporation, it's basically the investment arm of the Chinese Communist Party, is looking to buy a $100 million stake in Island Timberlands. So if that transaction happens, then, and if Harper then passes the Foreign Investment Promotion and Protection Agreement with China, then it means that Chinese investment interests in Island Timberlands could then sue any level of government, not just federal but provincial, for regulating those lands, for example, through log export restrictions, increasing the fee and view, the tax on log exports, if they had an expectation that they would have made profits in the future, and then you took that away from them by increasing the regulations, or by establishing a forest land reserve, like we're saying, like an agricultural land reserve, or by regulating the private lands more heavily. So that's one of the concerns about China as well, is that it is possible that they may build up their own manufacturing capacity and have a big interest in raw log exports, and through that federal agreement with China, then undermine the ability to restrict log exports, if it all plays out that way.
So that's a federal, obviously, initiative, so it almost feels like there's two fronts, right? There's the provincial right now, but stopping that is a key, is like absolutely essential.
Yeah, there's a lawsuit with, it was
And supporting
Brandon
that lawsuit,
Sayers, and
whatever
Lead Now are
ways
the
we
ones.
can, right?
Yeah. And then what was the second one you just asked about? I have ADD, what's the?
Oh, it was the carbon sequestration.
Oh, carbon, yeah. Yeah, actually, the Sierra Club just put out a report on the importance of old growth. You can look on their website, and there's a new report stating that.
Yeah, I just read that.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm referring to, is that how then with that report, how can that be, used in terms of, looking at car targets and
Yeah, well, there's a big push. It was actually by, the people have the book called Plants of Coastal BC, Pojar McKinnon, so the Bible of BC tree huggers and botanists. It's a great book. So Jim Pojar wrote a report a while ago about how we need to protect 50% of the forests of British Columbia as an important carbon sink. That would go a long ways towards reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. And Ontario and Quebec both have committed to protecting 50% of their forests. Now, there's controversies around some of those, right? Because the trade-offs of different mining industries and so forth. But there is a push in British Columbia for protecting 50% of the forests. It may sound like a lot, but you know what? This is a massive province.
I think I'd just like to entertain maybe one or two more questions, and then invite Janet up before we sort of change this to a slightly more casual format. There's coffee and cookies. We'd welcome you all to stay after that. So Ellen, and then Graham.
Yeah, just on the trade agreement thing, Claudia. It's not federal. It's not solely federal. If this government said no, if the provincial BC government said no to the China agreement, they could not constitutionally go ahead with that. So it's absolutely critical that people are being canvassed, or if you have connections within the NDP or the Liberals, to ensure that the next person who sits in on those meetings about the agreement with China, about the agreement with Europe, about, there's just an endless series of these things that are job killers and that will gut regulation. We are not powerless in BC. We used to have people in that trade department that said no when they went to because I worked with them and I knew them, and they said no, and they were hammered by everybody else, and they were hammered by the federal government, but they slowed things down. So this is a pivotal thing to say at the doorstep. No more NAFTAs, no more FIPAs, no more CETAs, no more of these trade agreements that kill our jobs.
Graham, and then Janet.
Actually, they were pretty awesome in that last round around the midterm timber supply committee. So, in the BC Interior, as a result of the pine beetle expansion, but also like decades of overcutting, they're projecting a fall down, a big crash in the available timber in relation to the milling capacity. So they wanted to open up the old growth management areas, the areas that were supposed to be protected for old growth, the recreation areas, the unglit winter ranges, the wildlife habitat areas, riparian management zones, open them all up. It's sort of like depleting all your wood source around your home, and then like breaking up parts of your home for firewood at that point, because burning up your house, and then you really end up with nothing, right? So the association was actually quite vocal against opening up the old land use plans. But the problem is the committee has created a sort of a roundabout way to open up the plans, and they say, well, we'll review the old objectives and see if through the community involvement basically industry guys likely sitting there, who will then say, review whether or not those land use plans are meeting their old objectives. And then the question is whether or not, like what are the objectives they're aiming for now? And if it's emphasizing timber supply, then that may be their way into those old growth areas. So I have a lot of worries about the central interior as well.
And there's that new act that's proposed, which that all-encompassing laws with that little bit about the Forestry Act in there too, which is proposed as a change in the next couple of weeks, right?
Oh, I forgot to mention one of the most important things. I'm totally bad here. My bad. Okay, what it is the government is just introduced a bill, Bill 8, that would allow the conversion of forest licenses into tree farm licenses. Now, most of British Columbia, about 80% of the forests are volume allocations, where companies get a certain volume that they are allowed to cut, but they don't get a designated geographic area like a tree farm license with exclusive logging rights. Once you establish a tree farm license, then you have a spatially defined area where one company gets exclusive logging rights. It makes it more difficult to establish protected areas and settle treaties because it ups the certainty that that company would have profited from logging that area. You take it away, then you up their compensation price. That's the general idea. So it becomes a disincentive towards protection of those areas and makes treaties also more expensive and drawn out. And so the last thing we want in this province is greater corporate control over the land. It's greater community control. This is a big deal because they're proposing to start off in Burns Lake with the rebuilding of the Hampton Mill to give them a tree farm license there. If this goes unopposed, then we need, they can do it anywhere. It's a Trojan horse to use the pine beetle and the Burns Lake area to pass a law which enables the Minister of Forest to policy to create tree farm licenses everywhere, TFLs all across the province. That's it's one of the worst things that could happen. And I know Christy Clark's government's in turmoil right now with the ethnic gate thing. But they may still sneakily try to pass this. And the NDP hasn't been speaking up on this very much. They've got to, I like a lot of the NDP policies, but they've got to go a lot further, and especially they can't play it safe before this election. They've got to take some progressive environmental stances up front, because we are going to hold their feet to the fire as well, and we will call it as we see it. We know the BC Liberals are ass backwards, we're going to point that out, but if the NDP do not make commitments around saving old growth, and they basically, kind of like, throw marshmallows against the TFL expansion without really fighting it, then, we will call them on that as well.
I haven't heard back from Nicholas Simons on that issue when I wrote him.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you all.